3,000 years ago, an extraordinary people rose from humble beginnings to force their will on the world. They created the greatest empire mankind had ever seen. An empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. It lasted 1,000 years and shaped the way we live today. I'm Larry Lamb, actor, radio presenter, and history fanatic.
I feel like a kid at Christmas.
In this series, I'm going to travel back beyond the marble monuments to ask who these people were and why they were so successful.
Wow.
From the empire's earliest ruins to her first conquests in Africa. From kingdom to republic, from Romulus and Remus to Julius Caesar. I want to uncover the extraordinary story of how Rome became the world's first superpower. 400 BC. Rome is now 300 years old and a powerful city-state. General Camillus has destroyed the neighboring city of Veii and conquered Rome's bitter enemies, the Etruscans. The Roman army seemed invincible, and the world theirs for the taking. But just 6 years later, disaster. When Rome faced a cataclysmic event that turned everything on its head. Now I'm tracking down a clue to this devastating episode. It's not a statue or a temple. In fact, it's in the last place you'd ever expect, deep in the heart of Rome's Termini train station.
Not exactly what you'd expect to find in the middle of, say, King's Cross Station. Large piece of architectural remains.
But this great big chunk of masonry is only a small piece of the puzzle. It's just one of a number of fragments dotted around the city. Sticking out of a house here, in the middle of a traffic island there.
A roundabout in the middle of Rome. Fantastic.
And when I say around the city, that's exactly what I mean. They're all part of one gigantic monument called the Servian Walls, 11 miles of colossal defenses that surround ancient Rome. These enormous protective walls were built in a hurry centuries after the city was founded. So the question is, why?
The main circuit that we see and appreciate today, the Servian Walls, are mostly built in the 4th century BC. That's after the famous sack in 390.
The sack by whom?
The sack by the Gauls. And what happens is a large nomadic tribe of Gauls descends down into the peninsula of Italy. The Romans ultimately go out to meet them, and they're crushed. And then the Gauls have a free pass to come into the city. They're razing and pillaging and plundering. So this is an infamous moment in Roman history. The only people that came in antiquity and just went right through and razed the city to the ground.
Where was the army during all of this?
That's a great question. This is like the epitome of defeat.
The Roman army was caught off guard and completely failed to stop the barbarians who attacked Rome with a vengeance. They ransacked the city, burnt homes and businesses, murdered its citizens, and left Rome on the brink of collapse. Frightened survivors fled the city, and, incredibly, so did terrified soldiers. Only when the Gauls demanded payment of a ransom did General Camillus, conqueror of Veii, finally step forward, with a last-minute display of some true Roman grit. Instead of gold, he offered the Gauls the cold steel of his sword. On that heroic cue, his soldiers at last rose up and drove out the barbarians.
I never realised that Rome had come so close to destruction and that the citizens were about ready to desert the city. But when you see the size of those new walls that they built, you really understand just how psychologically battered they'd been.
With these imposing walls, the Romans cried never again. But Rome needed more than walls. Next, they turned to the army that had failed them, with a plan to turn it into the ancient world's ultimate fighting machine. But finding direct evidence of this transformation isn't easy, which is why I'm traveling 5 hours north of Rome to Cremona.
Very little military evidence has survived from the Roman Republic. That makes it difficult to picture what the army was like. So I've come here to see one particular artifact that evidently has a story to tell.
It's housed at Cremona's museum, but not on display to the general public. This rare and precious piece of Roman history is kept securely locked in the depths of the museum's archives, and I've been given the chance to see it at close hand.
I feel like a kid at Christmas.
They're even letting me remove the final layers of wrapping to reveal.
And this is a Roman soldier's helmet. It's inscribed as well.
The owner of the helmet inscribed it himself. It has his name, M, which is an initial for Marcus. And then there's AR, which is Aruntus. It's the name, in fact, of his owner. He was a slave, a freed slave.
Oh, was he?
And then we have a P, which means pound, and the numeral 8. So what he's telling us is this helmet belongs to Marcus Patrolius, the freed slave of Aruntus. And this helmet weighs 8 pounds.
Can I pick it up?
Oh, sure.
Can I? Just to get a sense. It's not too bad, you know what I mean?
Not too bad.
You wouldn't want to be in the hot sun with it all day long. You'd know you'd been wearing it. That would be just about bearable, I think.
The point is, this helmet dates from the 3rd century BC, which means it was one of the very last to be handmade by a slow and laborious process of casting and hammering. This is old, pre-transformation technology. If Rome was going to radically increase the size of its army, they needed something far more efficient than this cottage industry approach. So they turned to the lathe. The Roman version would have been animal or slave-powered, but it still allowed a skilled craftsman to transform a bronze disc into a basic helmet shape in a fraction of the time.
Were the Romans actually doing this on an industrial scale?
Probably, yes, to standardize and to speed up the production of great number.
Right. Grazie, signore.
A few skilled cuts with the tin snips later, and we're almost done.
They would start to leave the helmet this way.
What, when they were making a lot of them?
Yes, yes.
They wouldn't finish them off?
Yes.
Just put them on people's heads and
Yeah.
get them off to war, yeah? That's it. Here it is, mass-produced helmets, Roman style. The push was on, they needed more, and making them in forges and banging them with hammers wasn't enough. Weapons, armor, and battle tactics all received the same dramatic overhaul as Rome's army was geared up for a century of expansion throughout Italy, which would bring it face to face with its greatest and deadliest foe. Rome had almost been destroyed by the Gauls in 390 BC and was determined never to allow such a defeat again. They built new, impregnable city walls and transformed the army into a professional fighting force with no room for cowardice. Reading Polybius here about the Roman military system, you get a good understanding of what the discipline was like. I mean, desertion, for example, a single man was punished by what they called decimation, when every 10th man in the cowards' cohort was beaten to death by 9 of his comrades. And if you fell asleep on sentry duty, the punishment was being stoned to death. So they really didn't mess around, did they? Fueled by the humiliation of defeat, the Romans decided the best form of defense was attack. They embarked on a century of aggressive expansion, conquering and assimilating city after city, tribe after tribe. By 265 BC, their 300,000-strong army had bullied and fought its way south to reach the very toe of Italy. Any further advance would bring it into direct conflict with an even older civilization, the Carthaginians. The city of Carthage, now in modern Tunis, was the Rome of North Africa, with origins reaching all the way back to the 9th century BC. The city began as a small port founded by Phoenician or Punic traders, but it quickly grew in size and wealth to become the center of power in the Mediterranean, long before Rome had even begun to conquer its closest neighbors. At its peak in the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginian Empire stretched from modern Tunisia all the way to Spain and controlled all sea trade in the Western Mediterranean. But who exactly were the Carthaginians? For a rare insight into the sheer sophistication of Rome's great Punic rivals, I'm making my way to the remarkably well-preserved ruins of a coastal town called Kerkuan.
This is Kerkuan, right? And we're, what, it's about 100 miles from Tunis?
That's right, yes. It's really a microcosm of what Carthage would have been like. This is basically a fishing village. This is a really small place, but it still has these incredibly grand houses.
These houses had courtyards, wells, intricate mosaics, all in a seaside town. And wait till you see the luxuries on offer.
This is the wet room, basically, and the bathroom area. You've got a sort of hip bath for 2 people.
So I've got to have a sit in there. Look, I'll get in the... There we go. They're very nice. Rather liking this. Get the slaves to bring a little bit of... Well, I've done maybe some ass's milk. Yeah, yeah.
We've got a little holder here. It could be a soap holder.
It's filled with warm water. It'd be absolutely lovely.
And you also have public baths here, and you can have sacred areas with pools in.
Very neat, isn't it?
It's very neat, and that's the real difference between Carthage and Rome. In this period, Rome is a kind of tangled mess of little streets. It's hidden inland up a river, whereas Carthage is this magnificent seaport laid out on a grid full of great public architecture, incredibly cosmopolitan city. This is something the Romans won't have for a couple of 100 years.
So they're way ahead, aren't they, at this point, the Carthaginians?
You could put it like that, and perhaps that would have occurred to some Romans as well.
But for all the Carthaginian sophistication and wealth, what the Romans really envied was their mastery of the sea.
They had extraordinary expertise in navigation, commerce, and this incredible strategic position controlling the Straits of Sicily. All of east-west shipping in the Mediterranean has to pass by Carthage. And this is at the same time as Rome is beginning to build up its land empire, and they're getting closer and closer together from south and north.
So immense competition between them.
As they're getting closer together, a clash is becoming inevitable.
The Romans had come face to face with their greatest adversary yet. Now it was just a matter of when they would clash and where. I've come to the island of Sicily. Caught midway between these two opposing forces, this became the flashpoint for an epic conflict known as the Punic Wars. It would rage for 100 years. This central position of Sicily, within the influence of both cities, meant things here were certainly going to come to a head. And in 264 BC, they very definitely did. A local dispute gave the Romans the excuse they needed. In a deliberately provocative move, they sent supplies and troops to support one side, forcing the Carthaginians to support the other. The clash for supremacy in the Western Mediterranean had begun. But in confronting this new enemy, Rome faced a significant problem. The Carthaginian Empire had been built on the strength of its navy. So, to achieve an undisputed victory, Rome needed to defeat them out there, at sea. But with no navy and no naval tradition, how could the land-based Romans challenge this established maritime power and expect to win? The answer to that was revealed in an astonishing archaeological discovery. In the 1970s, the timbers of a Carthaginian warship were recovered from the depths. They suggest that these master craftsmen might have scored a spectacular own goal.
It was a very important moment for the Romans. We found a ship. It was a Punic warship. We found in the planks Punic writings that were done by the carpenter to join the different pieces.
So each piece had a number or a figure, and that fitted into that piece. These Punic symbols were basically assembly instructions for a sort of flat-pack navy, telling Carthaginian shipbuilders which piece fitted where. Trouble was, if they could read them, so could the Romans.
This, I think, that helped so much the Romans. They were taking some boats, some ships, they were taking to their docks, then they were dismantling and studying how they were built.
They took them to pieces, yeah?
Yes.
And looked at each piece and how that fitted together.
Yes. They understood little by little how to build a ship.
The Romans immediately set to work and built a fleet of 120 warships in just 60 days. But with no tradition of navigation or fighting at sea, they still needed to rely on their skills as a land army. But how? Their solution was sheer genius. It was a secret weapon that would take the Carthaginians completely by surprise. It was known as the corvus, the crow. It was a hinged wooden bridge that swung out over the bow of the ship and dropped onto the enemy vessel. Giant spikes on the underside smashed into the timbers and pinned the two ships together, allowing the Romans to board the enemy ship. The corvus had its first outing at the Battle of Mylae, off northern Sicily in 260 BC, and it took the Carthaginians completely off guard. The corvus effectively turned the battle into a fight on land, giving the Romans the advantage they needed. They sank or captured 50 enemy ships and lost just 11 of their own. But the war raged on for another 20 years, allowing Rome to sharpen their seafaring skills until they could take on the Carthaginians at their own game. Nowhere was this demonstrated more clearly than in 241 BC, in the biggest sea battle of the First Punic War, the one that would decide the outcome. Everything we know about this battle comes from histories written at least 60 years after the event, so we can't be sure how reliable they are. But now, state-of-the-art underwater archaeology is providing hard evidence and turning myths into reality and revealing the first ancient naval battle site. And I'm going to get to go and see it firsthand. I'm aboard the scientific research vessel Hercules and heading to the waters off the northwest coast of Sicily. Legend has it, this pivotal encounter took place here, near the Egadi Islands. Polybius describes how ships fitted with metal battering rams attacked each other head-on. Maneuvering an entire warship into position for a precision attack like this requires the very highest level of seamanship. So, for centuries, historians took these grand claims with a pinch of salt. But since 2005, Dr. Jeff Royal and his team have used echo sounding and robotic cameras to search these waters for evidence to support Polybius's account.
Just spin a little and see what's... Pan to the right or spin to the right? Yeah, just spin the whole spin right.
Recently, Dr. Royal's team struck pure archaeological gold, or more accurately, bronze. Breaking the surface for the first time in nearly 2,500 years, this is one of those actual battering rams. But it's only the latest of 11 rams discovered here since 2008, all of which have amazing stories to tell about the epic battle that took place here.
Having studied the artifacts, we see rams that have frontal damage. No other damage on the rams, except in frontal damage where it appears they've struck something that was equally as hard, and in one case actually dented it in a V shape that matches the front end of other rams.
It must have been an incredible sight. 450 warships jostling for position, trying to smash and tear holes in the enemy, all fueled by a bitter mutual hatred. And just how bitter is revealed in a message to the gods etched on one of those battering rams.
This is Punic one because we know from the inscription that is written, it says that Baal, that was the most important Punic god,
right,
that Baal could let penetrate this object into the body of the enemy ship.
In the same way that they used to paint inscriptions on bombs in the Second World War, yeah?
Yes.
Send this one to Hitler or something, yeah.
Even though they outnumber the Romans by 50 vessels, the Carthaginians' prayers fell on deaf ears. Their losses ran to 120 warships, 4 times the Roman casualties.
And for me, that says exactly why the Romans would always rise above the rest. I mean, who else would challenge Carthage at sea, expecting to win, and even at those odds, come out on top?
Defeating the Punic navy meant the war was over, leaving Rome the master of the known world, for the moment. 241 BC, Rome had won the First Punic War by seizing control of the Western Mediterranean and leaving Carthage a broken empire.
The Republic's victory in Sicily had come with a price. It had won them the war, but it had triggered a hatred of Rome and the Carthaginians that will be passed from father to son for generations to come.
One son in particular would grow up to test the Roman strength to the limit. At the age of 9, his hatred was sealed in sacrificial blood by his father, who made him swear an oath of vengeance against the Republic. That boy's name was Hannibal.
Within 20 years, his burning ambition to restore his lost empire would put the two rival powers back on a collision course as he began Carthage's second war on Rome.
The Romans had defeated Carthage at sea. Now Hannibal would challenge them on land. It was the one move Rome least expected because it meant a 1,500-mile detour via a seemingly impossible route. Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps in 218 BC is one of the great achievements of this or any other conflict. 50,000 men and 67 war elephants entered this foreign landscape of perpetual winter, avalanches and hazardous crevasses. Hunger, fatigue and bitter cold made each step harder than the last. 16 grueling days later, the mountains were behind them.
With half his men and most of his elephants dead, Hannibal had finally crossed the Alps into Italy. An amazing feat, but that was never the real challenge. That would come next, last far longer, and cost many, many more lives.
Hannibal's endgame was nothing less than taking the city of Rome itself. But first, he had to defeat its armies on their own soil in a series of battles that would lead to his ultimate victory at Cannae. The exact location of these battles remains a mystery, but I want to know how he was able to defeat the Roman army. Historian Richard Miles has made a study of this legendary campaign.
Now, Hannibal is a fantastic general, a brilliant strategist, and the Romans are no match for him. And so in the first two battles, he wins easily and destroys much of their army. But at Cannae, in 216, this was the big one.
To steal his spectacular victory, Hannibal cunningly outwitted the Romans with tactics they'd never seen before.
And what he did is he realized that the Romans were tending to bunch all their best troops in the middle. As you would do, you put your best troops right in the heart of your army.
Knowing that the Romans expected him to do the same, Hannibal placed his weakest troops in the center with his finest men on the wings.
And so the Romans get drawn in and they get sucked in. They think this is easy, as they push forward. Yeah. And what they don't realize is those strong Carthaginian troops come around the side of them and basically surround them. And then it's like a killing zone, like a total massacre.
In one of the bloodiest battles in ancient history, the Roman army was decisively and humiliatingly cut down at Cannae. 70,000 soldiers slaughtered, 10,000 more taken prisoner, and worse still, Rome lost 80 of its greatest commanders. It destroyed the Roman military, and now Hannibal marched straight to the capital. In 216 BC, the Romans witnessed a terrifying sight. A deadly enemy camped outside the city. Not the Gauls this time, but the Carthaginians.
Exactly what they don't want, like this whole sort of this freaky old fear that they've carried for 150 odd years, right? It's all happening again.
A very nice piece of understatement, exactly what they don't want.
Yeah, yeah. What's going on inside, you know, between the Senate and the people?
Inside Rome, there's all sorts of finger jabbing and finger pointing and recriminations going on, of people blaming each other.
This was Rome's worst nightmare. Surely nothing could stop Hannibal fulfilling his father's wish. Rome's destruction seemed inevitable.
What happened next?
Well, it's a complete anticlimax, damp squib. Everyone's waiting for him to attack. Everyone's panicking. Then he goes away again, marches off.
And the thing that I find really puzzling is after all this great big campaign and he's finally arrived at the gates of Rome, why didn't he attack?
Well, I think the first thing is that, I mean, attacking a city with huge, great walls around it is not an easy thing to do. It takes time. You know, you have to sit out there for God knows how long. What he really wants to do is he wants to get them to the negotiating tables. Right. You have to think about the way that wars have been fought in this period in the ancient world. You fight, and then when one side are beginning to lose badly, you come to the table and you negotiate and you work out a deal. Yeah. The Romans break all the rules of diplomacy and war, because the Romans don't have any kind of reverse gear. So they will not negotiate with you, even if you've got them like that by the jugular. They will not negotiate with you. They say, no, bring it on, bring it on. Really? And so how do you negotiate with somebody who won't negotiate with you? Yeah. And so I think he's flummoxed.
The mighty Servian walls had done their job by making a full frontal attack impossible, and Hannibal simply couldn't afford a 10-year siege. What had really beaten him, though, was the intractable Roman mindset. It left Hannibal no choice but to retreat. Typically, the Romans' first thought was vengeance. This was especially true of one general who'd lost his father and uncle in the fight with Hannibal. His name was Scipio Africanus.
Just as Hannibal hated Rome, Scipio hated Carthage. All he needed was an opportunity for revenge.
His chance came 14 years later in 202 BC. As consul, Scipio took an invasion force of 35,000 men to North Africa, vowing to defeat Hannibal once and for all. But Hannibal's army boasted even greater numbers, 40,000 soldiers and 80 war elephants. These two opposing forces came together at Zama, somewhere out there on the African plains. On the eve of battle, Hannibal and Scipio stepped forward to meet face to face. Between these two men, control of the whole Mediterranean world was hanging in the balance. According to Polybius, Hannibal was the first to speak.
Our rival claims on Sicily first made us enemies. I wish Rome had never coveted lands outside Italy, nor Carthage any outside Africa. All that remains for us now is to put an end to this obstinate hostility. I, for one, am ready to do this.
To sweeten the deal, Hannibal even offered to relinquish the Carthaginians' claim to Sicily, Sardinia and Spain, which would leave Rome the master of the Mediterranean.
Hannibal's offer seems to be quite reasonable. What does that tell us about the position the Carthaginians were in at the time?
Well, the problem is he's got nothing to offer. He's offering to vacate these possessions outside Africa, but the Romans have already taken all these possessions. So it's a reasonable offer, but in the position he's in, it's a silly one, as Scipio points out to him.
If you had left Italy voluntarily, you would not have been disappointed in your request. But as we have conquered your land, things are very different. What is my conclusion? That you must submit yourself and your country to Rome unconditionally, or else conquer us on this battlefield. How does Hannibal respond?
Well, the conversation's over at that point. Hannibal can't unconditionally surrender on behalf of the Carthaginians, so the battle's on.
The Carthaginians had almost double the number of infantry, plus Hannibal's 80 war elephants. But Scipio had the advantage.
The Romans have finally learned how to deal with elephants by this stage. So as soon as the battle starts, the Romans start blowing their trumpets right at the elephants, which panics the poor animals. Half of them turn around and trample their own forces. The other half carry on into the Roman ranks, but the Romans are ready for them, and they simply part, open up huge corridors in among the infantry, and they simply pass through the Roman troops.
Scipio then shrewdly deployed the tactics he'd learned from studying Hannibal's campaigns.
The Roman cavalry easily routs the Carthaginian cavalry, then comes round the back, outflanks the Carthaginian army, and basically it's a massacre.
Right.
20,000 Carthaginian dead, 20,000 enslaved, against 1,500 Romans killed.
But these losses were only part of the price the Carthaginians would pay for their failure at Zama. As well as a financially crippling indemnity of 10,000 silver talents, Scipio made sure he hit Carthage where it really hurt.
With the exception of 10 warships, their entire fleet was sailed out into the bay and burnt in front of the city.
So brutal, isn't it? Burned all their ships, I mean, the source of all their wealth.
Yeah. It was an important statement for the Romans to make.
Yeah. The reparations alone were intended to put Carthage out of commission once and for all. But the Carthaginians had survived Rome's hard-nosed peace settlements before and managed to pull themselves back from the brink. So it sort of leaves me wondering, despite Scipio's tough talk, if Rome had actually done enough.
By 202 BC, Rome had smashed the Carthaginian army for the second time and imposed brutal trade sanctions. But would this be enough? More convinced than anyone that Carthage was a real threat capable of rising again was Senator Cato the Elder, a veteran of the Second Punic War, whose hatred of the Carthaginians had only intensified over the years. I've come to Tunis, site of the old city of Carthage. I'm retracing the journey Cato made in 157 BC when he led a diplomatic mission here. This gave him the perfect opportunity to assess the level of threat for himself.
Cato was expecting to see a city on its knees, but what he found here absolutely appalled him.
Carthage was obviously prospering, which convinced Cato that it must also be rearming. But was he right?
He would indeed have found a really thriving city here. And Polybius tells us that Carthage was the richest city in the world. The first thing he would have seen when he was coming into the harbour would have been the incredible sea walls that were plastered in white so they would look like marble, really spectacular entrance to the city. And then when he got inside, he'd have found this thriving city full of wealth, full of weapons, full of young men of military age, he says. And it's a real danger to Rome. They found a lot of timber, which could be used to build boats, but they didn't find the boats. But that might be because they didn't actually come into this part of the harbour, because this was behind an extra wall.
Really?
Yeah.
So it was a hidden...
This was a hidden part of the harbour.
Right.
And behind it was something extraordinary, a massive naval shipyard where the Carthaginians were building a secret navy.
This looks to me like something of a slipway, yeah?
Right, and it's not the only one. This entire island in the middle of this circular port is a shipshed complex. You could probably fit 50 or 60 ships all in slipways like this. And around the edge of the port, there was a whole other set of slipways. Altogether, you could probably fit 170, 180 ships in here. And we're talking large ships. We're talking the kind of ships that you could take to war. So what we seem to see here is probably some kind of military complex.
This model of the original shipyard reveals an astonishing piece of military engineering. Cato may never have laid eyes on it, but he'd already seen enough to confirm his suspicions. He rushed back to Rome and louder than ever repeated his battle cry, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The Senate took him seriously, and the Romans instantly attacked, catching the Carthaginians by surprise. They surrounded the city and discovered the Carthaginian secret armada. They now had their most bitter enemy by the throat.
The Romans forced them to disarm. They completely disarmed. And then the Romans told them, we will only make peace with you if you move 10 miles inland and we destroy your city. And naturally, the Carthaginians couldn't accept that, so they decided to stay and fight.
In 146 BC, the Romans launched their final attack on Carthage. Nothing would be spared.
Were they under orders to destroy everything?
They seem to have been. They seem to be under orders to kill everyone they met, and when the soldiers were clear, they burnt. It's easy to destroy the lower city. It was much more difficult to destroy the Birsa Hill, the citadel, and so that was the very last point that they attacked.
With the lower city in flames, Birsa Hill became the last refuge of the Carthaginian people. These few ruined houses are all that remain of this once magnificent city, the site of a final, desperate struggle for survival.
What the people who live here are doing is they're going up to the roofs of these houses.
So these are the lowest, this is the lower section. This is the lowest
stories. Well, these are the stone sections. Above there would have been 6 stories of wood. And what happens is that they're raining missiles and torches down on the Romans trying to come up the hill towards the summit. Eventually, what the Romans realise they have to do is they start taking the houses systematically from the bottom, and then they come up to the top. They throw the inhabitants down 6 stories into the street below them.
Down into where we're standing now.
Down into where we're standing now. They start putting gangplanks across the roofs. You see the houses are really close together.
Right.
So then you've got Romans moving along at street level, and you've got Romans coming 6 stories above them across the roofs and killing everything they see. And they have to keep the way clear for the soldiers to keep coming up. They keep getting reinforcements. So they organise these cleaning parties. And of course, what they're clearing isn't just the debris from the buildings and so on. It's the people. The people who are falling from the roofs, all the children, the old people who've taken refuge in the houses, are burning to death, screaming. Some of them were just thrown into the drains head first, and then the Roman cavalry come up and just crush their skulls on the way up.
Over them, yeah?
It just completely ride over them. It's absolute destruction. This goes on for 6 days.
6 days of it?
6 days of the hill burning, really trying to kill every living thing on the hill.
Most chilling of all, the evidence is still visible today.
This looks like it's a sign of fire, is it?
No, absolutely. These are the marks, the scorch marks from these fires, and you can see them all along. All the uprights have been scorched by the fires, scorched red and black. So it's not surprising that we can see these scorch marks still today, because the city burnt for 17 days.
The clash of civilizations was over. With this ruthless act of destruction and genocide, Rome had won its world war.
Carthage fell. And of course, that didn't just spell the end for it as a city. What it really meant was that it was finished as a political power.
I set out to understand what set the Romans apart from all the other tribes, nations, and civilizations that they conquered. They borrowed tactics and weapons. They absorbed their defeated enemies. And they even learned from their own disasters. But that wasn't all.
I think my old friend Polybius will sum it up best. Even if they happen to be defeated at the outset, the Romans carry on the war with all their resources. For the Romans, knowing themselves to be fighting for their country and their children, can never weaken in the fury of their struggle, but continue to fight with all their heart and soul until the enemy is overcome.
The Mediterranean was theirs. They named it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome was now master not just of a republic, but of an empire. Next time, I learn how Rome turned its back on its own citizens and discover the unlikely hero who fought for justice for the people, but paid for it with his own life.